The storm that broke over the capital that night was a pale imitation of the one raging inside the royal palace. They would call it a crime of passion, the bloody, desperate work of a jealous lover caught in the act. Tonight, you will learn it was something far colder, a crime of perfect calculated vengeance. But when a queen weeps and her champion holds a bloody dagger, can you trust what your own eyes are telling you? The crash of thunder was the only sound that answered the queen's scream. It echoed through the velvet-draped corridors, a sound of pure, theatrical horror. When the guards finally battered down the door to the king's private chamber, they found a scene of brutal carnage. King Alistair lay sprawled beside his bed, his silken robes soaked in a crimson that was not part of their design. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood and the fresh, clean smell of rain from a window that had been thrown open to the raging storm. And standing over the body, illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning, was Lord Valerius, captain of the royal guard. In his hand he held a dagger, its blade dripping with the king's lifeblood. He was frozen, his handsome face a mask of utter shock and disbelief, as if he had just woken from a nightmare to find it was real. Queen Ilara was the one who found him. She collapsed at the doorway, a perfect portrait of a devastated wife, pointing a trembling finger at the man everyone knew was her secret lover. He told me the king knew," she wailed, her voice breaking with practiced precision. "He said it was the only way we could be together. By the gods, what has he done?" The guards needed no further convincing. They seized Valerius, who offered no resistance. He was in a daze, stumbling, muttering, "No, she called for me. I just arrived." But his words were drowned out by the queen's heart-wrenching sobs and the damning evidence of the dagger in his hand. The narrative was set in stone before the king's body had even grown cold. It was the tragic, predictable end to a forbidden affair. A tale of a loyal knight driven to murder by his love for a queen he could never have. But as Ilara wept into the shoulder of a comforting lady-in-waiting, her eyes, for a fleeting moment, were not filled with grief. They were cold, clear, and fiercely intelligent. She was not a victim in this tragedy. She was its author. A knight in chains, a weeping queen, and a dead king. The story seems simple, but in the halls of power, the simplest stories hide the deadliest secrets. I want to know how far this tale of vengeance is echoing. Comment below from what city or country you're watching this bloody game unfold, and subscribe, because the Queen's first move has just been played, and the board is already soaked in blood. In the cold, damp dark of the palace dungeons, Lord Valerius tried to piece together the shards of the last hour. The world had shattered, and he was left holding the sharpest, bloodiest piece. He remembered the note, slipped under his door, written in the Queen's elegant script. "He knows," it had said. "Come to his chambers. I am in danger." He remembered the frantic rush, the fear for her life coiling in his gut. He remembered finding the chamber door unlocked, the window open to the storm, and the king already dead on the floor. In his shock, he had knelt, his eyes falling on the ornate dagger beside the body. His own dagger, a ceremonial gift from the Queen. He had picked it up, his mind numb, just as Ilara's scream had sealed his fate. Now sitting in chains, the truth began to dawn, a horrifying, creeping light. The note was a forgery, the scene was a setup. He had been perfectly, flawlessly framed. But his mind, still clouded by a deep and unwavering love, could not make the final terrible leap. He did not suspect the woman he loved of betrayal. He assumed they had been framed together by some shadowy enemy, a third player in their dangerous game. His devotion, the very thing that had driven him to her side, now blinded him to the truth, making him the perfect, tragic pawn. Above ground, the political vultures were already circling. The king's death had created a power vacuum, and the court was a flurry of feigned grief and furious calculation. In the first emergency session of the Privy Council, factions began to form. Lord Tyrrell, the ancient and pragmatic Lord Chancellor, spoke for the majority. "The evidence is undeniable," he declared, his voice heavy. "A crime of passion. The captain of the guard, driven by a forbidden love, murdered his king. The law is clear. Justice must be swift to prevent chaos." He looked at the Queen, who sat veiled in black at the head of the table, a perfect silent sculpture of sorrow. The king's younger brother, Duke Cailan, was far more vocal. He slammed his fist on the table, his face a mask of righteous fury. "Swift justice is not enough," he roared. "This cur betrayed his oath, his king, and this kingdom. He should be tortured for his treason before he is hung from the ramparts." Publicly, he demanded vengeance for his brother. Privately, he could barely contain his glee. With the king dead and the Queen's name now irrevocably tied to a murderous scandal, his own path to the throne was suddenly beautifully clear. But one voice dared to dissent. Sir Gideon, Valerius's grim-faced lieutenant in the royal guard, stood before the council. "I have served with Lord Valerius for 15 years, he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of accusations. "I have seen him hold a line against 1,000 men. I have seen him show mercy to a beaten foe. He is a man of honor and discipline. The man who did this," he gestured towards the king's sealed chambers, "was a frenzied butcher, not a soldier. This was not a lover's rage. This was an assassin's work, designed to look like one." His words fell into a hostile silence. He was questioning the simple, convenient story that everyone, especially the Queen, seemed so eager to believe. And at the head of it all sat Ilara, her performance flawless. But beneath her veil of grief, her mind was a whirlwind of memory. She remembered the night just a week ago when her own world had ended. Hidden behind a tapestry, she had listened to her husband, King Alistair, speaking with his brother, Duke Cailan. She had heard him lay out his cold, cruel plan to have their marriage annulled, to set her aside now that she had given him an heir. But the final blow, the one that had ignited the murderous rage in her heart, was what he said about Valerius. "Her loyal hound," the king had laughed. "Once the Queen is gone, I will have a use for him. The border savages are getting restless. A suicide mission for a man of his talents. A fitting end for one who covets the king's property." In that moment, Ilara knew. The king was not just going to discard her. He was going to murder the only man she had ever loved. Her bloody act in the king's chamber was not a crime of passion for a love she hoped to have. It was a cold, calculated act of vengeance for a love she was about to lose. She had framed Valerius, not because she hated him, but because in her twisted, desperate logic, a condemned traitor in a dungeon was safer from the king's assassins than a celebrated hero on a battlefield. She had to destroy him in order to save him. Sir Gideon, a man whose loyalty was etched as deeply as the battle scars on his face, knew his commander. He had seen Lord Valerius hold a collapsing gate against a horde of screaming barbarians, his courage a burning torch in the darkest of nights. The man he saw languishing in the dungeons was not the same man. Gideon visited him once. Valerius was a ghost, haunted by a puzzle he couldn't solve, his mind trapped in a loop of love and disbelief. "It was a trap, Gideon," Valerius whispered, his eyes distant. "Meant for us both. Find him. Find the enemy who did this to our Queen." Gideon listened, his heart heavy. He saw that Valerius was a lion caught in a gilded snare, and his love for the Queen had blinded him to the nature of the trap and the identity of the hunter. Gideon left the dungeons with a cold, grim resolve. His commander was lost, a casualty of a war he didn't even know he was fighting. If Valerius was to be saved, Gideon would have to uncover the truth alone. His investigation began where the official one had ended, the king's blood-soaked bedchamber. The council, in its haste to name Valerius the killer, had been careless. They had seen what they wanted to see. Gideon, however, looked for what was missing. The narrative was a crime of frenzied, passionate rage, but the chamber was too orderly, No chairs were overturned, no tapestries torn. The king's book lay on a nightstand, a pair of reading glasses resting neatly beside it. A man surprised by a raging, jealous lover would not have had time to set down his spectacles so carefully. Gideon scanned every inch of the room, his soldier's eyes missing nothing. Then he saw it, partially hidden beneath the heavy velvet curtain near the window, almost invisible against the crimson rug, was a single, perfect petal from a scarlet rose. It was fresh, its edges still soft. Gideon knew the palace gardens. He knew the king despised roses, finding their scent cloying. But Queen Ilara's private terrace was famous for them. She was never seen without a scarlet rose pinned to her gown. It was her personal sigil. It was a small, insignificant thing, a detail no one else had noticed. But for Gideon, it was the first thread, a thread that connected the queen to this chamber, not as a horrified discoverer, but as someone who had been present before the chaos began. This single inconsistency gnawed at him. The scene was wrong. It felt staged. A warrior like Valerius, if driven to kill, would have done so with a single efficient strike. The multiple, almost clumsy stab wounds felt like a performance, a bloody piece of theatre. On a dark hunch, Gideon sought out the royal physician, Maester Calin, a timid man easily cowed by authority. He found him in the dispensary, nervously sorting herbs. "I have a question about the king's wounds," Gideon began, his voice low and intimidating. The Maester began to recite the official story, but Gideon cut him off. "I am not interested in the story, Maester. I am interested in the truth." "Was there anything else? Anything you were told to overlook?" The old man's face went pale. He wrung his hands, his eyes darting towards the door. Under the weight of Gideon's unrelenting stare, the truth finally spilled out. "His fingernails," the Maester whispered, his voice trembling. "They had a faint blue tinge, and his lips, a sweet, almond-like scent. I was told by Duke Calin to record only the wounds, to avoid speculation that could cause a panic." Gideon felt a chill run down his spine. Cyanide, poison. The king had been poisoned. The horrific, brilliant truth of the conspiracy crashed down upon him. This was not a crime of passion. It was a cold, premeditated assassination. The frenzied stabbing was a gruesome charade, a bloody distraction to perfectly frame a man famous for his skill with a blade. The entire narrative, so eagerly accepted by the council, was a lie. And in the center of that lie, Gideon now saw a new suspect, no longer a weeping widow, but a cold, calculating killer with a scarlet rose as her sigil, the queen herself. Queen Ilara was not a fool. She had known from the moment she conceived her desperate, bloody plan that Sir Gideon would be a problem. His rigid honor and his dog-like devotion to Valerius were liabilities she could not afford. While she played the part of the shattered widow in public, in private, she was a spider at the center of a new web, one spun from the palace's own secret passages and forgotten servants. Her spies were the chambermaids no one noticed, the stable hands everyone ignored, and they brought her news. They told her of Gideon's visit to the dungeons, of his second private examination of the king's chamber, and most alarmingly, of his tense conversation with Maester Calin. She knew with a chilling certainty that he had discovered the poison. He was no longer just a doubter, he was a hunter, and she was his prey. Her perfect crime was beginning to fray at the edges. Her plan had to accelerate. She could not simply let Gideon be discredited. She had to destroy him. Her counterattack was a masterpiece of cold, calculated cruelty. It was a symphony of deception with two movements. The first was simple and direct. Through a loyal kitchen servant who owed his family's lives to her charity, she obtained a small, unmarked vial of the same sweet-smelling poison that had killed the king. That night, another of her agents, a lithe young page boy who could move through the castle unseen, slipped into Sir Gideon's private armory. He carefully unscrewed the pommel of a ceremonial sword, a relic Gideon never used, and placed the vial inside, a serpent hidden in a soldier's steel. The second movement of her plan was more subtle. She penned a letter herself, her hand disguised in a rough masculine script. It was an anonymous coded note, supposedly from a conspirator to Sir Gideon. "The captain rots, as planned," it read. "The Duke suspects nothing. He is a fool, eager to take the throne. Once he does and the Queen is dealt with, our true work can begin. The payment is where we discussed. The letter was a work of genius. It did not just implicate Gideon in the king's murder. It painted him as the mastermind of an even deeper conspiracy, a traitor who had framed his own commander in a plot to eventually betray Duke Cailan and seize the throne for himself. It was a lie that fed perfectly into the court's existing fears and ambitions. She did not send the letter to the council. That would be too direct. Instead, she had it left in the path of a minor, ambitious baron she knew to be a sycophant of Duke Cailan. As she predicted, the baron, seeing an opportunity to win favor, delivered the intercepted letter directly to the Duke. Cailan, a man of simple, brutish ambition, saw his entire worldview confirm in the short, damning text. His brother's death was no longer a simple crime of passion. It was the opening move of a vast conspiracy aimed at his own life. His grief, however performative it may have been, was instantly replaced by a surge of paranoid fury. He did not wait for the council. He did not consult the Lord Chancellor. He gathered his personal guard and stormed into the training yard where Sir Gideon was overseeing the morning drills. "Treason!" Cailan roared, waving the letter in the air. "I have proof of your black-hearted betrayal." Gideon was completely blindsided, his denials lost in the Duke's furious accusations. On Cailan's command, the guards searched Gideon's quarters. It did not take them long to find the vial of poison hidden in the ceremonial sword. The trap was sprung. Sir Gideon, the one man who knew the truth, was dragged away in chains, accused of the very crime he was trying to solve. From a high balcony overlooking the courtyard, Queen Ilara watched the scene unfold, her face a serene, unreadable mask. She had not only framed her lover, she had just framed the man who would have been his savior. The last loose thread had been cut. With Sir Gideon silenced and the court convinced of a deeper, now quashed conspiracy, the path was cleared for the final act of Queen Ilara's bloody play, the trial of her lover. It was not a trial for truth, but a piece of political theatre designed to cauterize a wound in the kingdom's side. The great hall was arranged not for justice, but for a spectacle. Duke Cailan, his face a mask of solemn authority, presided over the proceedings, his brother's death having conveniently made him the most powerful man in the room. Lord Valerius was dragged before the council in chains, no longer the proud captain of the guard, but a broken man, his confusion having curdled into a deep, hollow despair. The case against him was presented as simple and absolute. The Duke's men presented the evidence of Sir Gideon's plot, the anonymous letter, the vial of poison, framing it not as proof of Gideon's guilt, but of his attempt to manipulate an already guilty man. They argued that Gideon had intended to use Valerius's crime of passion as a stepping stone for his own ambitions. It was a twisted but convenient logic that the council, eager for a swift end to the chaos, readily accepted. Valerius was no longer a mastermind, just a simple, foolish murderer. The climax of the sham trial was the Queen's testimony. Ilara entered the hall, a figure of profound tragedy, veiled in black, leaning on the arm of a lady-in-waiting as if she could barely stand. Her voice, when she spoke, was a soft, trembling whisper that carried to every corner of the silent, rapt chamber. She recounted a story of a devoted but desperate lover, a man who, upon learning that the king had discovered their affair, had snapped. "He came to me that night," she lied, tears tracing paths down her cheeks. "He said, He said the king was going to send him away to have him killed on some remote battlefield. He said there was only one way we could be free. I begged him not to, but he wouldn't listen. He was consumed by his love, by his fear. She painted a perfect picture of a man driven to murder by a desperate, all-consuming passion. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, a story that gave the court a monster they could understand and a victim they could pity. But as he listened to her weave this beautiful, damning lie, something inside Valerius finally broke. He had been drowning in confusion, unable to believe the woman he loved could betray him. But hearing those words, spoken in that soft, practiced voice, he finally saw her. He saw the cold, brilliant strategist beneath the weeping widow. He saw the truth in all its horrifying clarity. The love that had blinded him was burned away in an instant by the fire of her betrayal. With a roar of pure animalistic agony, he lunged against his chains, his eyes locking on hers. "Liar!" he screamed, the word ripping through the hall, raw and full of a pain that went beyond the fear of death. "Liar! I loved you. Why are you doing this?" For one fleeting second, the Queen's mask of sorrow slipped. Her eyes met his, and in their cold, clear depths, he saw no grief, no regret. He saw only the chilling resolve of a predator. And he finally understood. The court saw the desperate outburst of a guilty man. He saw his own executioner. The verdict was a formality. Lord Valerius was found guilty of regicide and high treason. Duke Calen, with grim satisfaction, sentenced him to be beheaded at dawn. As the guards dragged him from the hall, Valerius's eyes never left the Queen. The love was gone. The confusion was gone. All that remained was the silent, haunting gaze of a man who had seen the face of the devil he had once mistaken for an angel. Ilara sat, receiving the condolences of the court, her performance unwavering. She had won. She had avenged the future the king would have stolen from them. She had saved her lover from a suicide mission by sending him to the executioner's block instead. The war was over. She was finally, terrifyingly, safe. She stood alone in the silence, the victor and the sole inhabitant of a wasteland she herself had created. With the verdict delivered, a veneer of grim order settled over the palace. The crisis was officially over. The killer was caught, justice was imminent, and the line of succession, it was assumed, was clear. But for Queen Ilara, the silence in her chambers that night was louder than any scream. Her great, terrible gambit had succeeded. She was safe. She was free. Yet the victory felt like ashes in her mouth. She had played the game of thrones and won, but the board was now empty, and she was the only piece left standing. The look in Valerius's eyes as he was dragged away, that moment of pure, agonized understanding, had become a ghost that would haunt her far more than the memory of the king she had killed. She told herself it was the only way, a brutal act of surgery to cut out a cancer, a necessary sacrifice to save him from a certain death on a forgotten battlefield. But as she stared at her own reflection in the dark glass of her window, she saw not a savior, but a monster, her face pale in the torchlight. Her solitude was interrupted by a soft knock. It was a court page, delivering a formal notice from the Lord Chancellor. Her blood ran cold as she read it. Duke Calen had summoned the council for a meeting at mid-morning, just after the scheduled execution. The agenda was simple: the formal appointment of a Lord Regent to rule until the young prince came of age. Ilara realized her mistake. In her focus on eliminating the king and his spies, she had ignored the jackal waiting patiently in the wings. She had not won her freedom. She had merely cleared the path for a new tyrant, her husband's brutish and ambitious brother. She had traded one cage for another, and the bars of this new one were already closing around her. In the king's study, Duke Calen was celebrating his ascent. He poured wine for his own loyal lords, his laughter echoing in the room where his brother had been murdered just days before. To a new era, he toasted, his eyes alight with a lust for power. An era of strength, free from the whispers of spies and the whims of women. He spoke of his plans, openly, arrogantly. The Queen would be a useful symbol of grief and stability, but her power was gone. Her son, the prince, would be raised under his firm guidance. He would be Lord Regent for life, the true king in all but name. He saw the path ahead as a straight, clear road, paved by the foolish, emotional crimes of others. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet was about to split wide open. In the deepest level of the dungeons, a single torch cast long shadows on the damp stone walls. By the grace of a sympathetic jailer who had once served under their command, Sir Gideon was granted a final meeting with Lord Valerius. The two condemned men sat in silence for a long moment, the air thick with the stench of death and betrayal. Gideon was the first to speak, his voice a low, hard rasp. He explained everything he had found: the poison, the staged crime scene, the single scarlet rose petal. He laid out the cold, logical steps of the Queen's masterful, horrifying deception. Valerius listened, his face impassive. The wild pain from the trial had settled into a profound, glacial calm. Gideon's words were not a revelation. They were merely the confirmation of the truth he had already seen in Ilara's eyes. "She did it to save me," Valerius said, his voice hollow. "The king was going to have me killed. She chose the axe over an assassin's knife." Gideon shook his head. "She chose power, and she used your life and mine as the currency to buy it." He leaned closer, his eyes glinting in the torchlight. "But she made one error. She is a queen, and she thinks like a courtier, with lies and poison. I am a soldier, and a good soldier always has a contingency." He revealed that before his arrest, he had sent a detailed account of his findings and a final set of orders to his most trusted officer in the city watch. A force loyal to him, not the palace guard. "The watch has the evidence," Gideon whispered, "and they have their orders. If the execution proceeds at dawn, they are to storm the palace. They will not be coming to save us. They will be coming to dispense justice." Dawn broke, cold and grey, over a kingdom about to witness a tainted justice. In the grand courtyard, a scaffold stood stark against the morning sky. Lord Valerius and Sir Gideon were led out in chains, their faces grim but unbowed. The court was assembled, a gallery of nervous, whispering nobles. Duke Cailan stood on a raised platform, radiating an aura of smug, absolute power. This was to be his first act as the realm's new master, the brutal public execution of his brother's killers. From a high balcony, veiled in black, Queen Ilara watched the scene she had orchestrated, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. This was the final, terrible step. Valerius's public condemnation was the price of his life, a life she intended to spare with a secret pardon and exile once the Duke's attention had moved on. It was a desperate, monstrous plan, and it was about to go horribly wrong. The executioner, a hulking figure in a black hood, raised his massive axe. The crowd fell silent, a collective intake of breath. As the axe reached the apex of its swing, a sound cut through the morning air, not of steel meeting flesh, but of a single, piercing horn blast from beyond the palace walls. The great iron gates of the courtyard, sealed by the Duke's order, shuddered once, then burst inward with a deafening crash. The city watch stormed in. They were not a chaotic mob, but a disciplined, iron-willed force of veterans, their shields locked, their spears leveled. They moved with a chilling efficiency, surrounding the scaffold, their numbers far greater than the stunned palace guards. A grizzled watch commander strode forward, holding a parchment sealed with Sir Gideon's sigil. "This execution is halted by order of the law," he bellowed, his voice the roar of a lion. "We hold here irrefutable proof of a conspiracy to conceal the true cause of the king's death." Chaos erupted. Duke Cailan, his face purple with fury, screamed at his guards to attack to cut down the insolent watchman. But his men hesitated, caught between a usurper's rage and a wall of disciplined steel holding evidence of treason. The courtyard became a powder keg, ready to explode into a bloody civil war. In that moment of absolute tension, all eyes turned upwards to the lone, silent figure on the balcony. Ilara's plan was in ruins. Her careful, cold calculations had been shattered by a soldier's unwavering loyalty. There was no more room for lies, no more space for manipulation. There was only the truth. She removed her veil. Her face was not the face of a grieving widow, but of a sovereign. Her voice, clear and powerful, carried across the entire courtyard, cutting through the fear and confusion. "The commander speaks the truth," she declared. "The king was poisoned." Then she did the one thing no one expected. She confessed, "But the hand that administered the poison was mine." A collective gasp, more profound than any before, swept the crowd. "I stand before you, not as a murderer, but as an executioner," she proclaimed, her voice ringing with the force of absolute conviction. "I learned of a plot by my husband, the king, to discard his queen and assassinate a loyal and decorated soldier to satisfy his own petty cruelties. I committed treason to prevent a greater one. I removed a tyrant before he could plunge this kingdom into disgrace. My actions were for the good of the realm. Judge me as you will." Her confession, backed by the evidence held by the watch, was the checkmate. The narrative was no longer about a jealous lover, but about a queen who had dared to strike down a corrupt king. The soldiers of both the watch and the guard, faced with this truth, lowered their weapons. Duke Kaelin's authority evaporated into nothing. He was seized. His pathetic screams for loyalty ignored. Valerius and Gideon were freed, their chains falling to the stone with a clatter that sounded like the birth of a new age. Valerius looked up at the woman on the balcony, the woman he had loved, the woman who had framed him, and the woman who had just confessed to the world to save him. The love was gone, lost in the labyrinth of her magnificent, terrible lies. But in its place was a dawning, complex, and profound understanding. Ilara stood alone, the undisputed ruler of a kingdom she had won not by birthright, but by blood, fire, and an unbreakable will. She paid a terrible price for the truth, but some truths are worth any cost. Her vengeance wasn't about blood, it was about rewriting her own story. What is a truth you would fight for? Let me know in the comments, and if you believe the most powerful stories belong to those who refuse to be silenced, subscribe to the channel.